Welcome once again to Conceived in Liberty, the Bradley Speaker Series. I'm Rick Graber. Thanks for joining us in this series of conversations with former Bradley Prize winners. During this difficult time, I think it's safe to say that all of us have more questions than answers, really in every aspect of our lives. Will schools open in the fall? How will America repay the massive debt that it has incurred in response to this COVID pandemic? And is our system of federalism holding up during this period of time? Our guest today is as well equipped as anyone to take a stab at answering all of those questions. Mitch Daniels is the current president of Purdue University. Among his many accomplishments at Purdue is freezing tuition, increasing enrollment, and lowering student borrowing. Mitch came to Purdue at the end of his term as the 49th governor of the state of Indiana. As governor, he was credited with balancing the budget, reducing the state's debt by 40%, improving the business climate in Indiana, and starting the nation's first statewide school choice voucher program. Mitch was also the director of the Office of Management and Budget under President George W. Bush, and he was a 2013 winner of the Bradley Prize. President Mitch Daniels, welcome.
Thank you, Rick.
Let's talk about Purdue. You were among the very first universities to transition to an online learning in response to COVID, and you're also one of the very first to announce your intentions to reopen in the fall. What factors led to that decision, and what steps are you taking to ensure a safe experience for students and faculty and your entire community this fall?
The first factor, and really a decisive one, was the learning that we all experienced about the very differential incidence of this virus, or at least its in its most lethal or dangerous forms. No one knew at the beginning, but we learned over the first several weeks or so that it's very, very dangerous for those who are elderly or suffer from various comorbidities, but not apparently dangerous at all among the young people who predominate on our campus. So that was very central. If it had been more general in its effects, I don't know how we would have reopened as a residential campus. But learning that 99.99% of the young people who make up over 80% of our campus community will not experience in many cases, any symptoms at all. Generally, unless they have some very serious pre-existing condition, only mild ones. That was the first and pivotal factor. Secondly, at least in our case, the unmistakable enthusiasm of young people who want to be at Purdue this fall. We have, much to our surprise, experienced a record number of applications, followed by a record number of deposits from students saying they want to be here. And so we feel an obligation to do all that's necessary to allow them to continue their education and not interrupt it.
You pointed out in a letter to the Purdue community that institutions of higher learning aren't exactly known for change. Is there an opportunity here for higher education to change the way that it provides education to students across the country?
There's an opportunity, one could say a necessity. The change was slowly coming to higher ed anyway in a couple of forms that are now much more visible and have been propelled forward. One is a use of new technologies and modes, remote teaching and learning, and so-called online education. That's been kicked into a much higher gear because people didn't have a choice. And then secondly, I think you'll see that there'll be, at long last, a lot of pressure on the cost structure of higher education, which has gotten beyond the reach of far too many families. And there's simply not going to be the option that was there for so long to raise prices year on year on year. And expect people to pay it without really much demonstration that they were getting quality for their money.
You used this year's commencement address to talk about loneliness, which seems appropriate in terms of the isolation that I think we've all felt during this period of time. But your speech didn't focus specifically on the current crisis. It was larger. You were talking about the impact of social media on younger generations. Talk about that a little bit.
I write those speeches or draft them over Christmas vacation every year, just to have the relief of knowing that at least something, I hope, a little bit meaningful and original is in the can. And so we barely heard about this strange virus at that time. No, I was writing about and reflecting on this growing body of information that rather astonishingly shows that social isolation and loneliness, with all the negative consequences that can come from that, literally on health or even life-threatening, have been growing, and more amazing to me than that, at least as fast or faster among the youngest people in our society. And I thought, what a sad thing, and it was worth drawing our graduates' attention to. I gave them some statistical evidence about things one can do about this, things like geographic rootedness, things like marriage, especially marriage with children. But in so doing, I related, as many others have, and many studies have documented, that among the causal factors, in addition to fewer siblings and smaller families, we have seen this explosion of so-called social media. I find it hard to use that term. I sometimes call it anti-social media. And our graduates, it occurred to me, are really the first humans ever raised entirely in the iPhone era. And so I wanted to bring this to their attention and suggest that they take some steps to guard against being sealed off from real human contact with other people, the thing that has always made life most worth living.
Totally agree. Let's switch gears a little bit and draw upon some of your experiences from prior chapters. What's your take on the trillions of dollars that Congress has spent in response to the virus and this talk of spending trillions more? You spent time in the Office of Management and Budget and know firsthand of all this. Talk about your sense of what's going on.
My sense is that under the circumstances, maybe not everything that was done, but something much like it probably was the best of a lot of bad options. But I'll say a couple things. One, it's often said in the context of monetary policy that it's dangerous for a central bank like the Fed to lower interest rates so low that they don't have any room to do anything more. I think the same thing applies here. If the federal government had not been running up massive deficits in administrations of both parties, the last two anyway, we would have had, let's say, a little more room for the splurge that just took place. So that's the first point. The second point is that this is going one day to compound what was already, in my opinion, a great social injustice, namely the infliction of unpayable debts on generations that didn't run them up, and a younger generation that does not have the consolation of knowing that the money was borrowed and invested in their future, but will look back and realize that the money was borrowed and by their parents and spent on their parents' consumption, and that is not a just or fair thing to do. And now, I suppose, out of necessity, we have made what was already a giant problem even more so.
From the perspective of a former governor, do you think that this has played out the way it should be, in the sense of governors forming their own response plans for the large part, or do you think the federal government should have played a more central role?
There were things that the federal government could have done, and they didn't start this year. The federal government, it could have heeded the advice of scientists over the past and stockpiled this or that and been a little better prepared. But no, I think in general, this has been and will be yet another validation of the federal system. This virus is very different from place to place. The incidence, sometimes even between adjoining states, is very different. And so having the flexibility to respond in ways that do match up to local conditions is, I think, been a positive. Now, another virtue of federalism is that it's self-correcting, so that states that do things that really work out well can be copied by others. And on the other hand, those that blunder will pay the consequences. And you're going to see some of that. I think there have been some, obviously, I think in general, very good performance, but there have also been some, I believe, very serious errors made in certain states. And as with anti-enterprise economic policies, eventually there's a cost as people leave, businesses leave, and investment dries up.
Let's stay on the topic of governors. They have a tough job right now. It's a balance between protecting public health and restarting economies that have been shut down for 3 months. What's your best advice to governors around the country?
Remember that you represent the entire public interest. I have no criticism of anybody's actions, at least at the front end of this. No one knew much of anything. I've suggested that we all ought to take a little vow of non-recrimination. Looking back, there have been some choices made that already we can tell were bad ones. But it was a very difficult time, as you say, and I think we should be understanding, certainly up to a point, of how people handled their responsibilities. But I would say that there was a temptation, I believe, at the beginning to look through one lens only, to, I won't say hide behind, but take refuge in advice that was given from solely one perspective, namely the so-called public health outlook. And as we're finding out now, and some are speculating, maybe more lives have been lost because of the nature of the lockdowns and the duration than were saved. Certainly there have been catastrophic consequences in people's lives that also count, should count in the eventual calculation. So I think that some officials for too long, let's face it, it seemed like a popular thing to do, and who could be against protecting people's lives? But there's always a danger in public life that when the benefits are very specific and very visible, and the costs are diffuse and spread across everybody in ways that are less visible. This is the problem with a lot of debt and government spending. There's always the risk that the broader public interest will not be served as well as it should be.
Mitch Daniels, thank you so much for your insights and your thoughts. We truly do appreciate it. Next time on Conceived in Liberty, the Bradley Speaker Series, we'll be joined by
Professor and historian Alan Gelzo. We look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much.